just been connected to the largest spiritual network on the planet, The Jeffrey Daugherty Show. Jeffrey Daugherty. Sink or swim, deep end information, parabiblical research, spiritual technologies, personal empowerment. Be your own guru. Guide your own spirit. Master your own ascension. And now, showing you how, here's Jeffrey Daugherty.
Hello, folks. Jeffrey Daugherty, The Jeffrey Daugherty Show. I'm the Christian whistleblower, and here we are, back at it. Last week we talked out of the new book, Apostle Paul, ANTICHRIST, the new revised version, 50 more pages plus footnotes and completely annotated, available at www.imnck.com. Go there and make that, take advantage of that offer, get that book. It's a great book, perhaps the most important book about Christianity since the Bible, forward by George Norrie of Coast to Coast AM. You can also go on my YouTube channel and listen to the Coast to Coast interview that we did back in April. Now, last week we talked about Alexander the Great, we talked about Nero, we talked about Gamaliel, we talked about Paul and Jesus having met on 2 occasions, and I want to look at the second and third of those meetings between Paul and Jesus, and I want to focus on something that jumped out to me, something that literally leapt off the page, and I wish it would have leapt before I wrote the book, Apostle Paul, Antichrist. But that's one of the things, you write a book, it's printed, it's 410 pages, it's out there, and there's no oops, let me add this in, because this is something that I just recently saw, and to me it's extremely profound, and it's opens up some great insights, and I'm going to be incorporating it into my new book, which I've completed the first draft, and that'll be out soon, in addition to the Diamond New Testament, which will be out soon. But in the book of Mark, the 10th chapter, Jesus meets someone that is addressed as the rich young ruler. That's what we've always been told that he is. I believe this rich young ruler was Paul. It was a wealthy Roman Jewish aristocrat, and Paul is one of the very few people that would fit those parameters. And the man asked Jesus a question, what do I do to inherit eternal life? Of course, Jesus said, you know what to do, keep the commandments. Paul says, I've kept those commandments my whole life. Jesus says, yeah, I know, but you're lacking one thing. Sell everything you have, give it to the poor, and then come and follow me, which I find to be absolutely fascinating. Here's Jesus saying to Paul, come follow me. And I believe that Jesus is giving a sincere, legitimate, real offer to Paul to be counted among the disciples. Think of that. Paul, Saul of Tarsus, was offered an apostleship, was offered a chance to be a disciple by Jesus himself at this early date. Jesus already picked 12 apostles. Paul would have been the 13th, which is interesting. So how could there be 13 apostles when the Bible talks a lot about there being 12? Well, Jesus probably knew what was going to happen with Judas. Then that would have precluded the machinations with Matthias becoming the one to replace Judas. Maybe Jesus knew. And maybe Jesus knew, of course he knew, I think he knew all of this, but he knew what Paul was going to do. He knew the havoc Paul was going to reach on the church, wreak all that stuff on the church. He knew how bad it was going to be, and he was offering this discipleship, this apostleship, I'm sure in one sense to ward that off, but in another sense he saw the potential within Paul, and even when you are as, I can't even think of the word right now, even when you're pointing out the faults and as are against, that's the best word I can think of right now, Paul, as I am, you have to admit and see that the man was able to take a false doctrine and turn it into the de facto quote-unquote Christianity. He was able to usurp and hijack the Jesus message and turn it into his own control-based, fear-based religion that is still with us today. And I have people every single day, multiple people every single day, writing me to tell me what a low-down, good-for-nothing, dirty, rotten SOB I am for daring to speak the truth about Saul of Tarsus, the self-proclaimed apostle. And that brings up an interesting point. Over and over, Paul called himself an apostle when no one else did, and when in fact everyone else refused to. The only place in the entire Bible where somebody other than Paul calls Paul an apostle is in the 2nd chapter of Revelation, where Paul is called a false apostle. Everywhere else, only Paul calls himself an apostle. If you get my Apostle Paul Antichrist fact sheet, you can see where Paul was constantly saying, I'm an apostle, I'm an apostle, I'm an apostle. Aren't I an apostle? I'm an apostle. I'm an apostle as much as they're an apostle. I'm an apostle. Paul continually said it. And the real apostles continually, steadfastly refused to identify him as an apostle. If you want that fact sheet, just email me, Jeffrey@imnck.com, or go to the website, imnck.com. Ask for it on the contact page. We'll get it out to you. It's free. And I wonder if all of this delusional, maniacal claims from Paul to be an apostle doesn't have as its root in his twisted mind, you know what, Jesus offered me to be a disciple back then. I turned it down, but I'm just going to accept it now. Paul thought that he could operate on his schedule and he could manipulate what Jesus told him and turn it into something that would work on his schedule. I just wonder if he told people that, if he presented people that. And you know, the apostles saw it. Maybe that's one of the reasons why they went out of their way to make sure that everyone knew he was not an apostle, because they were aware of that day and that time where Jesus offered it, and Paul rejected it. Fascinating speculation. How many of you ever even knew that the rich young ruler was Paul? How many of you ever knew that Jesus offered Paul an apostleship and he turned it down? And how many of you even knew that nobody outside of Paul ever called Paul an apostle except for one person called him a false apostle? All these facts add up, folks, and that's what the book Apostle Paul Antichrist is about. Why do you think George Norrie wrote the foreword? Because it's interesting, groundbreaking stuff. And what makes it even more interesting is Paul was offered the apostleship. He said no. He goes on down the road. He's fighting against Christianity. He's killing Christians. And then the road to Damascus happens, and suddenly a bright light shines about him. He hears a voice saying, I'm Jesus, go do this for me. Even though he's got 3 or 4 different versions, which makes one think the whole thing is most likely a lie. But when Jesus described this same type of thing, Jesus talked about in Luke chapter 10, where Jesus said, I saw Satan fall from heaven as lightning. It's the very same Greek usage as when Paul says, suddenly a great light shined about me. Paul says, this great lightning shines about me, and it was Jesus. And Jesus says, this great lightning shined about, and it was Satan. So Jesus looked at the same exact scenario and said it was Satan. Paul looked at the same exact scenario and said it was Jesus. Well, one of them is wrong, and it's certainly up to you to decide which one of them is wrong. Did Jesus make the mistake in the identification and application of that event, or Did Paul make the mistake? Well, I know what I believe, but you can certainly believe what you want to believe and make your own decision on that. But think about it. Paul offered an apostleship. He says, no, thank you. And then, on the road to Damascus, this being that Jesus identified as Satan, who convinces Paul that he's Jesus, uses this offer of apostleship that was made years before to convince Paul that he's doing the wrong thing, he's going the wrong way, and he needs to start preaching this new doctrine that this person that identified themselves as Jesus, that Jesus identified as Satan, gives to Saul. It's fascinating stuff, folks, when you begin to think about it. And in my new book that I have coming out, we're going to show beyond a shadow of a doubt that that entity that talked to Paul on the road to Damascus, as identified by Jesus as Satan, was probably the Lord Yahweh of the Old Testament, who is, yes, folks, Satan, the serpent, and the great red dragon. So get ready to yell at me about something else, because it's coming very, very soon, that new book. Now, all of these things, that's what Apostle Paul Antichrist is full of, is stuff like this. Things you never heard of, and there's a reason why you've never heard of them, because the church doesn't want you to hear about them. They provoke thought, and the church doesn't want you to think on your own. They want you to take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. Paul wrote those words, and what that really means literally is don't think for yourselves, just meditate on what we've told you. And if that's what you want to be, you know what? You're welcome to be it. It's your choice, but my, oh my, if you want to use your own mind, well, we're giving you some things to ponder, and we're showing you some ways to go to follow the true teachings of Jesus and not the hijacked and falsified teachings of Paul. So, folks, Jesus met Paul in Mark chapter 10. Jesus offered Paul to be a disciple. Paul said, no, thank you. Later on the road to Damascus, an entity that Jesus identified as Satan, Paul identified as Jesus, used this offer to get Paul to start going and preaching a different message, one that has become the world's greatest fear-based control matrix and still enslaves us to this day. Wow. That's something to start your week thinking about. If you have any questions or comments, Cliff's going to tell you where you can get me. I'm Jeffrey Daugherty, the Christian Whistleblower, wishing you peace and light.
Stay connected with the largest spiritual network on the planet, www.imnck.com. On Facebook, Jeffrey Daugherty and Jeffrey Daugherty Show. And on Twitter at NCKabbalah. Visit imnck.com today and learn how to create yourself and live the life you'll love.